The deep state is crumbling. Tulsi Gabbard just called out former President Barack Obama on live television, exposing his central role in what she described as the most coordinated political deception in modern American history. CNN tried to bury the moment, but it was too late. Her words were clear. Obama's involvement in the Russia collusion narrative was undeniable. What followed wasn't speculation. It was documented fact, backed by newly declassified intelligence, years in the making. Gabbard stood at the White House podium, not as a partisan voice, but as the Director of National Intelligence. With the full backing of President Trump and House Intelligence Chairman Rick Crawford, she addressed the press directly. There was no dramatization, no political maneuvering, just the blunt delivery of what had long been kept from the American public. At the direction of President Trump, and with the backing of House Intel Chair Rick Crawford, we're releasing the previously classified Oversight Majority Staff Report from September 2020, she stated. The words were heavy, but the real blow came moments later. We now have conclusive evidence that President Obama and his national security team fabricated an intelligence report to promote the lie that Russia helped Trump win in 2016. She didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to. The facts were already tearing through the room. They invented the whole thing. It was a fraud from day one. The press sat stunned. For years, narratives had been carefully constructed to frame the 2016 election as tainted by foreign interference, always with Trump at the center. But Gabbard was reversing the entire framework, not with opinions but with hard evidence. She continued. They relied on bogus sources, buried real intelligence, and violated standard protocol, all to sell a false story. Then came the broader allegation, the one that would shake the system if proven true. They worked hand in hand with legacy media to sabotage President Trump and drive a multi-year coup attempt. She made no attempt to soften the accusation. This goes beyond politics. It strikes at the core of our republic. The Director of National Intelligence was not making a political speech. She was leveling criminal implications against a former president and his entire national security team. The documents she referenced had long been requested under FOIA and stonewalled. Now they were fully public. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't anonymous sources. It wasn't a leak. It was a formal declaration from the top of the U.S. intelligence structure that a sitting president had used the intelligence community as a political weapon. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The American people have a right to know the truth, Gabbard said. They deserve transparency, accountability, and justice. She then listed the 3 documents now fully declassified. First, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence (ODNI) records. Second, the Department of Justice's so-called Clinton Annex. And third, a comprehensive oversight report from the House Intelligence Committee. All 3 had been locked away. Now, all 3 pointed to the same conclusion. The Obama administration grossly politicized and distorted intelligence in an effort to delegitimize President Trump before he ever took office, an assault on the democratic process itself, she said. No interpretation needed. The language was unambiguous. The documents revealed that U.S. intelligence officials were aware of Russia's true objective, to sow discord, not to support any candidate. But those findings were suppressed. In their place, a different story was pushed, one designed to suggest that Donald Trump was a Russian asset, placed in office with the help of the Kremlin. The claim dominated headlines, led to endless investigations, and shaped the media environment for nearly 4 years. Now the people behind that narrative were being named directly. Still, Gabbard wasn't done. She shifted attention to Hillary Clinton and the real motives behind the intelligence assessments. According to the newly unsealed report, Russian President Vladimir Putin had damning information on Clinton, intel that could have crippled her candidacy, but he chose to withhold it. Putin possessed explosive, potentially criminal intel on Hillary, but chose not to release it, Gabbard noted. Why? He believed she was going to win. That revelation flipped the 2016 narrative completely. While the public was told that Putin wanted Trump in office, intelligence behind closed doors suggested something entirely different. Putin, it turns out, had no interest in helping Trump win. His objective was to hold leverage over Clinton, the candidate the Kremlin believed would inevitably become president. Gabbard said it plainly. First and foremost, the report found that Putin's primary objective in 2016 was to sow distrust in America's democratic system, not to favor one candidate over another. It wasn't just that the intelligence community had misread Putin's intent, it was that Obama-era officials had seen the real picture and then chose to hide it. The report detailed how the 2017 intelligence community assessment released under Obama's direction was deliberately shaped to support a political narrative, not a factual one. Gabbard pointed to CIA Director John Brennan and others as central figures in that distortion. In Obama's 2017 intelligence assessment, CIA Director John Brennan and other top intel officials actively suppressed findings that showed Putin was holding back the most damning material on Clinton. That damning material, she explained, included documented meetings between U.S. State Department officials and certain religious organizations, where political support for Clinton was allegedly traded for funding promises. The implications were not just political, they were criminal, and yet none of this had been presented to the public until now. The documents were damning not because they suggested impropriety, they proved it. Gabbard walked the press through key findings from the House Intelligence Committee's oversight report. According to its analysis, intelligence assessments published in January 2017 were deliberately crafted to mislead the public. The official narrative had been molded to imply Russian support for Trump, when the underlying intelligence said otherwise. The distortion wasn't accidental, it was strategic, and it came from the top. Gabbard emphasized the selective editing process that had occurred behind the scenes. Raw assessments were filtered, inconvenient data was removed, and dissenting analysts were sidelined. The conclusions weren't based on a fair reading of the evidence. They were engineered to serve a political goal, delegitimizing the incoming administration, and they had succeeded. For 4 years, the Trump presidency was haunted by a cloud of suspicion, seeded not by fact, but by fabrication. But the most startling revelations were found in what Gabbard called the Clinton Annex. This section of the DOJ file had remained sealed for years. According to Gabbard, it exposed efforts by State Department officials to mobilize external groups, including faith-based organizations and NGOs, with the explicit aim of supporting Clinton's campaign narrative abroad. The exchanges included promises of increased U.S. funding in return for political statements and campaign-aligned messaging. In short, government resources were being used to fuel a domestic political operation under the guise of foreign policy outreach. This section also contained evidence suggesting direct knowledge at the highest levels. The annex included meeting summaries, internal memos, and classified communications that showed a deliberate plan to control the narrative around Russian interference. This wasn't speculation, Gabbard said. It was documented coordination between political operatives and senior government officials. The media, meanwhile, had played its role. Gabbard pointed directly at what she called strategic complicity. Certain networks were not just reporting government narratives, they were reinforcing and amplifying them without skepticism. She called it a coordinated media campaign, designed to create the illusion of consensus and suppress alternative voices. They didn't just get the story wrong, she said, they helped write the script. By the time she reached the details of the ODNY records, the silence in the press room had grown dense. According to the newly released files, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence had compiled internal assessments in late 2016 and early 2017 that questioned the prevailing narrative, but those assessments were never made public. Instead, they were overruled by political appointees who chose to elevate selected summaries over the full intelligence picture. One particularly disturbing document outlined concerns from career analysts who believed the intelligence was being weaponized. Their warnings were ignored. The final public version, released under the Obama administration in January 2017, was a carefully packaged report designed to do one thing: reinforce the claim that Donald Trump had only won because of Russian help. But the truth, Gabbard explained, was far more complex and far more damaging to the establishment. There were multiple drafts, multiple dissenting voices, and multiple warnings, Gabbard said. But none of that made it into the final report. What the American people saw was the version that served the political narrative, not the national interest. She didn't just blame bureaucratic failures. She named names. John Brennan, James Clapper, Susan Rice. Officials who had all shaped the public message were now implicated in suppressing contradictory intelligence. Their role, Gabbard asserted, wasn't just negligent, it was intentional. Meanwhile, the report highlighted how Vladimir Putin, far from being an active participant in Trump's rise, had actually restrained himself during the campaign. Intelligence assessments showed that Russia held material damaging to Hillary Clinton, material it had no intention of releasing before the election. The Kremlin had expected Clinton to win, and chose to preserve its leverage for future negotiations. In other words, Russian interference wasn't about helping Trump. It was about preparing for a Clinton presidency they believed was inevitable. That revelation alone reversed nearly everything the American public had been told. Gabbard stressed that this wasn't her theory. It was the conclusion drawn from official U.S. intelligence records, now fully declassified. The idea that Russia was invested in Donald Trump's success was a manufactured claim, she said. The real story is that Obama's intelligence officials withheld evidence that contradicted their desired conclusion. At this point, the pressure on media outlets to respond grew intense, but rather than covering the substance of Gabbard's remarks, CNN and others chose to cut the broadcast. According to live viewers, the feed dropped the moment she began discussing the suppressed ODNY documents. In its place, a network anchor appeared, framing the statement as an ongoing political effort to reframe the history of 2016. No questions, no analysis, just a redirect. What made it worse was how predictable it felt.
Gabbard, standing at the podium, had just outlined one of the most significant intelligence disclosures in U.S. political history. The documents were real, the findings were verified, yet the response from legacy media wasn't to report, it was to retreat. For millions watching, the moment became symbolic. It wasn't just about what was said, it was about who was willing to hear it. One side presented documentation and demanded accountability. The other side changed the channel. Back in the press room, however, the briefing continued. Gabbard had expected the media resistance. She called it out directly. It's no surprise some networks don't want this aired. They've spent years protecting a story that never held up. But the truth is not optional anymore. She reminded reporters that her statements were not partisan rhetoric. They were backed by declassified records, now available for public scrutiny. She encouraged independent journalists, legal experts, and ordinary citizens to examine the files themselves. The conclusions don't need to be sold, she said. They speak for themselves. She finished this portion of the briefing by stating what many in the room were struggling to process, that the Obama administration's 2017 intelligence community assessment was fundamentally corrupted by political motives. It had been presented to the public as a product of objective analysis. In reality, it was the result of coordinated manipulation, suppression of dissent, and strategic media reinforcement. And for the first time, the names behind that deception were no longer protected by redacted documents or anonymous sources. They were named, their actions detailed, and the paper trail now public. As Tulsi Gabbard laid out the final strands of the intelligence web, the reaction outside the press room was already underway. Viewers across the country had been watching the live broadcast until they weren't. CNN abruptly cut the feed just as Gabbard began referencing the most damning portions of the report. Her voice was mid-sentence when the screen went black. No technical issue, no warning, just a clean switch to a network anchor who casually dismissed the entire event.
"We've been listening to DNI Tulsi Gabbard," he said, continuing a multi-day effort to lend support to the rather extreme claim that President Obama committed treason and colluded with Hillary Clinton in some broader conspiracy. There was no acknowledgement of the documents, no interest in verifying the material, no effort to challenge the claims through evidence, only spin and silence. What made the moment so revealing wasn't just the timing of the cut, it was the arrogance behind it. A top U.S. intelligence official had just exposed classified corruption implicating a former president, and the response from the media was not to investigate, it was to pivot. But this time the audience wasn't buying it. Across social media, clips from the first part of Gabbard's briefing began circulating within minutes. Independent journalists, influencers, and even some former Obama administration critics began demanding answers. Why was the media shielding a former president from scrutiny? Why were declassified documents being ignored? The backlash was immediate. Hashtags trended. Screenshots of the cut feed were everywhere. Multiple users timed the CNN switch just as Gabbard was stating. Several intelligence community assessments issued in the lead-up to the 2016 election clearly concluded that Russia neither intended nor had the capability to affect the outcome of the U.S. election. The video feed stopped. There was no clearer indicator that the media wasn't interested in transparency. They were interested in control. Gabbard didn't flinch. She expected the media pushback, the smears, the deflections. That's why her briefing was backed with hard documents, not speculation. She continued calmly, reiterating that all findings were now available for public review. The facts don't require interpretation, she said. They require accountability. Inside the White House, staff began coordinating with independent outlets to ensure the full declassified files were mirrored and publicly hosted. Within hours, researchers, academics, and lawyers had access. It wasn't long before even skeptics, people who had long dismissed the deep state narrative, began to admit something wasn't right. Meanwhile, political pressure began mounting in Congress. Some lawmakers had quietly received early briefings from Gabbard's office before the public announcement. Now they were being forced to answer questions. Had they known? Did they approve of the findings? Would they support a formal investigation into a former president? The Democratic leadership initially tried to frame the report as political theater, but they didn't contest the authenticity of the documents. They couldn't. The signatures were real. The oversight report had been authorized under formal congressional procedure. The ODNI records were time-stamped. The Clinton Annex contained internal memos and meeting minutes. Nothing about it could be dismissed as fabrication. Even some members of the press who had supported the Russia narrative began to recalibrate. Editorials appeared quiet at first, cautious, but they were there. Phrases like "if verified," "potential political abuse," and "disturbing implications" began showing up in legacy publications. It was a subtle shift, but a noticeable one. The shield was cracking. Back in the intelligence community, internal discussions had already started. Whistleblowers who had previously been sidelined found renewed voices. A few confirmed anonymously that assessments had indeed been altered. Analysts had warned superiors in 2016 and 2017 that the intelligence being released was cherry-picked. Those concerns, they said, were handled politically. One former analyst wrote publicly, "I worked in that office. I saw what got cut. Tulsi Gabbard is not lying." The atmosphere was changing quickly, but for Tulsi Gabbard, it wasn't about political revenge. She wasn't running for office. She wasn't auditioning for higher power. She was fulfilling her duty as Director of National Intelligence, and more than that, her oath to the Constitution. "This is not a partisan issue," she said plainly. "This is a democratic crisis. A sitting president weaponized the intelligence community against an incoming administration. That should alarm everyone, no matter who they voted for." Still, questions kept mounting. Why had the media been so willing to cooperate? Why had so many journalists and pundits amplified the original collusion narrative without ever questioning its foundation? Why had simple document requests been denied, and truth so aggressively hidden? Gabbard didn't answer for the media. She simply reminded Americans that the tools used against Trump in 2016 could be used against anyone. "This is bigger than one election," she said. "It's about whether truth matters when power is on the line." As public interest surged, legal scholars began weighing in. Some argued that the revelations were grounds for investigation into possible criminal misconduct, abuse of power, falsification of intelligence, and obstruction of constitutional process. Others took it further, suggesting it could meet the threshold for criminal conspiracy. One former federal prosecutor remarked, "If these documents had come out in 2018, we'd be looking at multiple indictments today. This is systemic." At this stage, even some of Obama's allies in media and politics were going quiet. The familiar defenders weren't rushing to cable news. The talking points were slow to appear. There was hesitance, uncertainty, an unspoken acknowledgement that this might not be containable, and Tulsi Gabbard knew it. That's why she kept pressing. In follow-up interviews and formal briefings, she made sure the timeline was clear. The intelligence assessment released under Obama in January 2017 had been crafted with intent. Key findings were excluded, dissent was buried, and a fictional narrative was elevated to national doctrine, one that accused a sitting president of being a traitor without evidence. Now the evidence was public, and it told a different story. As the documents circulated and public discourse intensified, the one name that had been mentioned most, Barack Obama, remained untouched by any formal response. He issued no statement. His allies spoke in vague, dismissive terms. The press attempted to reframe the scandal as a Republican revenge operation, but they avoided engaging with the documents themselves. The silence was strategic and revealing. Behind closed doors, however, concern was growing. Members of Obama's former inner circle were reaching out to legal counsel. Some had been mentioned directly in the oversight report. Others had signed off on internal memos now made public. Every page of every document was time-stamped, logged, and authenticated. There was no escaping the fact that their fingerprints were all over the machinery that had driven the Russia hoax into the mainstream. The most direct accusations pointed not just to mismanagement, but to intent. Barack Obama had received regular intelligence briefings throughout 2016. He was kept informed of all developments related to foreign interference and electoral integrity. He was aware of Putin's posture, Clinton's vulnerabilities, and the internal debates among analysts. And he had the final say on which version of the intelligence community assessment would be presented to the public. According to Gabbard, the version that was ultimately published was one that deliberately omitted dissent and inflated claims that Russia had supported Trump. The president knew what was in the raw assessments, she said. He chose a version that served his party, not his country. That accusation alone was devastating, but the documents supported it. Meeting notes, internal ODNI drafts, and communications between senior staff made it clear that the White House had been actively involved in shaping the message. Obama wasn't just informed, he was directing the narrative, and it didn't end there. According to supplemental notes released alongside the report, Obama had also personally approved the use of select media contacts to strategically frame the narrative prior to the January 2017 release. The strategy was simple: leak select details to trusted outlets, frame the findings as overwhelming consensus, and marginalize any critics as conspiracy theorists. It worked, for a time. But with the declassified files now in public hands, the plan had collapsed. The media script no longer held weight, and the figure at the center of it, Obama, was now facing the most serious political accusations ever leveled against a former president. Some legal scholars began calling for the appointment of a special prosecutor. Others argued that congressional investigations should be reopened, this time without the partisan interference that had clouded earlier efforts. But it wasn't just lawyers and politicians raising the alarm. Retired intelligence officials, military veterans, and civic leaders began issuing public statements supporting Gabbard's call for transparency. What made this moment so different was the structure of the evidence. This wasn't a leak. It wasn't anonymous sourcing. It was the formal, authorized release of previously classified documents, confirmed and authenticated through the highest levels of U.S. government. And it pointed to one central conclusion: the Russia collusion narrative had not been an organic intelligence finding, it had been a top-down fabrication. The question that followed was obvious: why? Why would a sitting president orchestrate a narrative so explosive, so damaging, and so divisive, unless it served a larger purpose? Gabbard didn't speculate, but the documents hinted at motive. The Clinton Annex described internal discussions about protecting Clinton's image, countering the growing momentum behind Trump's campaign, and preserving Democratic power post-election. With Clinton expected to win, the narrative would serve to delegitimize any post-election criticism or challenge. But when Trump actually won, the same narrative was weaponized to undermine his presidency. This wasn't about Russia. It was about control. Control of the narrative, control of the intelligence, control of the future. And the architect of that control, according to the evidence, had been Barack Obama. Tulsi Gabbard's closing remarks during the second White House briefing made the point unmistakable. This was an outgoing president orchestrating fabricated intelligence to sabotage the will of the American people and initiate a years-long effort to delegitimize and destabilize the duly elected president of the United States, Donald Trump. There was no hedging, no ambiguity. It was a direct indictment of Obama's role, grounded in evidence, and supported by documents now seen and reviewed by millions. Meanwhile, panic began spreading in legal and political circles. Journalists who had spent years amplifying the collusion narrative were quietly reassessing their positions. Legal commentators began shifting tone. Phrases like potential criminal misconduct, abuse of power, and intelligence manipulation became more frequent in televised debates and op-eds. Even international media began covering the story. Foreign outlets less tied to the U.S. political establishment reported on the revelations with sharper focus. They highlighted the stunning nature of the allegations that a sitting U.S. president had weaponized national intelligence to influence domestic politics. The implications were massive, not just for Obama, but for future administrations, and for America's reputation globally. Inside Washington, political leaders from both parties found themselves under pressure to respond. Some Republicans called for immediate hearings. A few Democrats, cornered by the documents, began to distance themselves from the Obama-era intelligence team. While no one dared publicly criticize Obama directly, there were cracks, quiet condemnations, calls for clarity. Muted voices suddenly fell silent when the topic turned to 2016. Gabbard remained firm. In every public appearance, she repeated the same theme. This wasn't about revenge or politics. It was about truth. The American people had been misled. The systems designed to protect democracy had been hijacked, and the trust between citizens and their government had been shattered. What would be done to restore it? That remained unanswered. But Gabbard wasn't finished. As reporters continued to press her, one asked the question that had been circulating in whispers: does any of this newly released information suggest former President Obama may have committed a crime? Her response was immediate. We have already referred and will continue to refer these materials to both the Department of Justice and the FBI for criminal investigation, even if that includes President Obama. Correct. The confirmation was absolute. A sitting director of national intelligence had not only implicated a former president in a sweeping political conspiracy, she had confirmed that evidence had already been referred to federal law enforcement for potential prosecution. And she didn't hesitate when asked if Barack Obama himself was included. Correct. The moment wasn't just historic. It was seismic. For decades, former presidents had been treated as political untouchables, figures shielded by legacy, myth, and institutional loyalty. But now, that protection had fractured. The post-presidency image of Barack Obama, once crafted with precision and guarded by a compliant media, was no longer immune to the raw force of documented fact. Tulsi Gabbard stood unshaken. She reiterated what had already been made clear through hundreds of pages of declassified intelligence, that the Russia collusion narrative had not been the result of a botched analysis or partisan interpretation. It had been designed, manufactured, and driven from the highest levels of the U.S. government to deliberately undermine the incoming administration. This wasn't intelligence failure, she said plainly. It was intelligence manipulation. She pointed to the timeline. Intelligence reports from late 2016 showed that U.S. analysts had concluded Russia's actual objectives were to sow discord, not to support Trump or Clinton. The findings had been consistent, yet those very assessments were pushed aside, rewritten, and filtered through a political lens. The final version delivered to the public in January 2017 bore almost no resemblance to the internal intelligence that preceded it, and the individual who had overseen the process, who had final approval over the assessment,
the media strategy, and the messaging, was Barack Obama. By this stage, the scale of the scandal had become undeniable. It wasn't simply about one report, it was about the systemic corruption of trust. The press had amplified false narratives, intelligence officials had been silenced, opposing voices had been marginalized, mocked, and deplatformed. And now, with the truth finally public, the American people were left to reconcile a harsh reality, that their institutions had been used as weapons against them. The political world began to fracture under the weight of the revelations. Some Democrats called for caution, urging legal processes to play out. Others maintained a public silence, unwilling to defend Obama, but too afraid to criticize him. Republicans, on the other hand, seized the moment. Demands for a special counsel surged. House committees launched immediate hearings. Subpoenas were issued within days. Former Obama administration officials faced questions not just about what they knew, but when they knew it, and what role they had played in shaping the now debunked narrative. But it wasn't just political fallout. The Department of Justice quietly acknowledged that the declassified materials had been received. The FBI confirmed that multiple referrals had been made for internal review. Legal analysts across the spectrum began debating whether Obama could face prosecution under federal statutes related to abuse of office, falsification of government records, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States. History had ever faced credible, document-backed accusations of orchestrating an intelligence deception to influence a federal election. Watergate had brought down a presidency. This scandal threatened to unravel an entire legacy. For Tulsi Gabbard, however, the mission wasn't political. It was constitutional. She didn't celebrate the fallout. She didn't gloat. She stayed focused on what mattered most, restoring the public's right to the truth. In a follow-up briefing, she offered a final, firm message to the nation. The evidence we've uncovered and made public clearly shows that President Obama led the effort to fabricate the intelligence assessment, she said. There are multiple pieces of corroborating intel that confirm this, and the American people deserve to know that the truth was withheld from them by those sworn to serve it. She paused, then added, "No one is above the law, not even a former president." With that, the course of history shifted. The revelations ignited broader calls for institutional reform. Bipartisan bills were introduced to limit political oversight of intelligence assessments. Laws were proposed to strengthen protections for dissenting analysts, and a renewed national conversation began about the role of the intelligence community, the media, and unchecked executive power. The public response was polarized but engaged. For some, the documents confirmed what they had long suspected, that the collusion narrative was politically motivated from the beginning. For others, the revelations triggered disillusionment. They had trusted the narrative, they had believed the headlines, now they felt used, but there was no escaping what had come into the light. The intelligence community had been politicized, the media had been complicit, and the American people had been lied to on a scale rarely seen in democratic history. Obama himself remained silent. No press conference, no interviews. His defenders scrambled to shift the conversation. They claimed context, accused Gabbard of political bias, and attempted to reframe the narrative. But the documents spoke louder than any spin. The truth wasn't a matter of opinion anymore. It was a matter of record. And what happens next? That's the question that loomed over the entire nation. Would justice be pursued, no matter where it led? Would future presidents be held to the same standard? Or would institutional power once again shield itself from accountability? Tulsi Gabbard left that question with the American people. She didn't seek applause. She didn't ask for trust. She only asked for the truth to matter again. And now that truth was finally out.